we saw, for example, with the Council of Chalcedon, that there was already a certain difference in the way that Christianity in the eastern portion of the empire kind of acted versus the way Christianity in the western portion of the empire. We saw that all the debates about Christology leading up to Chalcedon were generally happening in the Greek-speaking eastern portion territory of the Christian faith at that time, and that Leo, representing the West, kind of had a different way of approaching that kind of a topic. So what that tells us is that there was just a certain amount of difference between Eastern Christians at this point and Western Christians. But throughout the first millennium of Christianity, we have to remember that by and large, there was relatively one Christian church, and there was a great deal of unity. There had certainly been breakaway groups. There were groups that did not sign on to some of the councils, and therefore they were separate from the larger institutional church. But by and large, most bishops of the church remained unified, and therefore most self-professing Christians were part of what could be seen as one unified Christian church. Everything is going to change with the Great Schism, which is the first big breakup in the history of the Christian faith. Now, the year itself of the Great Schism, according to typical church historians, is 1054. But we have to kind of do a little bit more history and backstory before we get to 1054, because there were centuries upon centuries of different things that caused tension between Christians in the eastern portion of the empire and Christians in the western portion of Christianity, as it was widely practiced throughout those first 1,000 years of the Christian church. So I want to focus on three areas of tension that lead us eventually to the Great Schism, where we will have an official break between so-called Western Christians and Eastern Christians. So three big causes of the Great Schism, which will be the name we give to that first major breakup. The first is kind of an underlying tension based on differences in language and culture that led to theological differences. So these are basic cultural and linguistic differences that led to theological differences. And this just simply created an underlying tension between Christians in the East and Christians in the West. So, for example, a different dominant language is being spoken. Christians in the East spoke Greek. Christians in the West had Latin as the dominant language, especially for the church and for theologians. When you have a different language and you have different cultures, different foods to eat, different clothes that are worn, for example, different understandings of genders, whatever it might be, when you have a different language and different cultures, it's natural that you're going to have slightly different theological approaches. Now, these didn't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive theological approaches. In many ways, they were just different emphases or themes. So for one example, when Christian thinkers in the West, Latin-speaking thinkers, talked about Christ's death on the cross, they would often emphasize Christ's role as the victim. He was that sacrificial lamb that was victimized in the sense of being put to death for our sake. Christian thinkers in the East, in the Greek-speaking portion of the world, would often highlight Christ's role as the victor. He is victorious over death in his facing of death. Now, both are true for the larger Christian story, but it was a matter of what was emphasized. Another example is that Christians in the West would often emphasize the oneness of the Trinity, whereas Christians in the East might emphasize the threeness of the persons in the Trinity. Now, both would agree that there are three persons making up one God, but it was just a matter of emphasis. And really, we can look back and say that having those different extremes kind of helped to pull the church always back to a balancing point. So yes, you had some different theological approaches and ways of thinking about the faith based on differences in language and culture. When you have different words that can be used to talk about something like theology, it's going to come out slightly differently in terms of a theological emphasis. So you had that underlying tension that we can think of as the first cause of the Great Schism, is you always had a little bit of tension. Most scholars will say even back to the first century, there was already different ways of approaching the faith among the Greek-speaking Christians and the Latin-speaking Christians, and that caused that certain underlying tension, a little bit of difference between these two portions of the Christian world. The second major cause of the tension that will eventually lead to the Great Schism is a specific theological word. And I've typed it here, filioque. Filioque simply means and the Son, S-O-N, and the Son. This was a specific word that Western bishops added to the Nicene Creed. And we read the creed in an earlier video. And remember in that third section, kind of when talking about the Holy Spirit, the creed says that we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, and who with the Father and Son is worshipped and glorified. The filioque and the Son was added right after proceeds from the Father and the Son. That was the filioque being added. So it's about the Holy Spirit's procession. Does the Holy Spirit proceed only from the Father, or does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son? Now, we don't have to worry too much about the theology behind this difference. The big thing here, I think, is that Western bishops met together at a council where they added this word. And this happened in the 6th century, so a couple of hundred years after the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople that beefed up the final version of the Nicene Creed. Western bishops meet together and they alter that foundational Nicene Creed by adding the term filioque. Eastern bishops, Greek-speaking theologians, did not accept the theology of the filioque, but of course what might have angered them just as much as anything was that the Western bishops were making a change without consulting the bishops of the East. I think we can all imagine how that would increase the tension between East and West, angering the Eastern bishops for not even being included in the changing of the foundational creed of the Christian faith, the Nicene Creed, which really had become one of, if not the most important statements of the Christian faith since the 4th century. So that's the second big cause of the Great Schism. The Western bishops adding the filioque without consulting the East, angering the East, and increasing that tension between East and West. The third major cause of the Great Schism is a phrase that kind of comes from a quote that happened after the schism by an Eastern archbishop, where the Eastern archbishop talked about primacy, not monarchy. Right? At that point, the bishop was talking about the role of the popes, the bishops of Rome. And he was saying that as you were making your way through the 8th, 9th, 10th, and into the 11th centuries, the bishops of Rome, or the popes, were acting more and more like monarchs over the entire church. That is, they were acting like they were in complete control of everything that happened within the Christian church. And the Eastern Archbishop was saying, we are okay in the East with granting the popes primacy. That is, we're okay with them being the primary figures in the church. In other words, we're okay with them having the loudest voice in the church. But we are not okay with them acting like monarchs. Or in other words, we're not okay with them acting like they have the only voice in the church. So the role of the papacy, or the role of the popes, becomes that third cause of the tension that's building up to a boiling point that will happen at the Great Schism. East is getting very frustrated with what they see as the grab for power by the bishops of Rome, the popes in the church. Remember, the bishops of Rome were historically only one of the 5 patriarchs of the early church, once the Bishop of Constantinople was added to the original 4. The Eastern bishops are all getting increasingly concerned that the popes are trying to have total power over the life of the church. So this actually kind of extends from what happened with the Filioque, with Western bishops kind of making that power grab. Now it's really focused on the role of the popes. And there's a lot of reasons about what's happening here with the popes reaching to the north for new kings like Charlemagne to help save them from Muslim conquest, etc. A lot of story here of what's going on, but that's the third major cause. So everything comes to a boiling point in 1054. The story itself is actually kind of interesting. Don't worry about too many of the details necessarily. The key thing we want to know is that the events of 1054 result in a mutual excommunication between leaders of the East and leaders of the West. And that's really what we see as the Great Schism, because that means that all Christians in the East who remain faithful to the leaders of the East are going to move in that direction, and all Christians in the West who remain committed to the leaders of the West will now move with them, which means we will have two separate institutional churches that are basically split along geographical lines. So it's not just a small breakaway movement like we might have had after some of the early councils. This is a major breakup. So what happened in 1054? Basically, you have a group from Rome or from the West traveling over to the East, representing the Pope and trying to meet with the Patriarch of Constantinople to seemingly perhaps get on the same page, right? Recognizing maybe that the Muslim invasion coming from the South and East is a common enemy of all Christians in the Roman Empire, and therefore it's time to get back on the same page. We're not exactly sure about what the Pope's intentions were, but we do know that the Pope died while his representatives were making their way to Constantinople. And again, the scholarship gets a little bit fuzzy here with some different views. But one view is that the cardinal who was in charge of the representatives actually kind of wrote a letter supposedly from the Pope, and he brought it to the Patriarch of Constantinople and gave it to him. And in this letter, which we don't know if it really represented the dead Pope's wishes or if it was more the views of this cardinal, but in this letter, it clearly said that the popes were in charge of everything in the Christian church. There was even a metaphor where the letter said, just as a door cannot move an inch except under the guidance of its hinges, so nothing can be decided in the church except under the control of the bishops of Rome, the successors of St. Peter. So clearly, here was that issue, the role of the papacy. And in this letter, you clearly had the papacy claiming to be the monarchy of the church, the only voice that really mattered. So this was rejected by the Patriarch of Constantinople, basically shoved the letter back into the cardinal's face. The letter eventually is kind of dropped on the ground. But at that point, in the shouting match that ensued, you had each side excommunicate the people from the other side. So again, the excommunications were technically only for those few individuals. But when the representatives of the Pope are excommunicating the major Eastern Patriarch, and the Eastern Patriarch is excommunicating the representatives of the Pope, you basically have a mutual excommunication of the entire Western Latin-speaking church and the Eastern Greek-speaking church, right? So what that means is you now have two separate churches. I've kind of typed them at the end of this page here. The Eastern churches will start to be referred to as Eastern Orthodox churches, or we just talk about Eastern Orthodoxy. And this is where you finally are going to no longer refer to the one Catholic Church, meaning kind of the universal church, but now specifically to the Roman Catholic Church, because it is a Catholic Church specifically centered on the authority of the bishops of Rome. So Roman Catholicism. That's really what happens in 1054 with the mutual excommunication that occurs. Now, within a few centuries, you start to have some different perspectives here. And you actually have bishops from both sides come together at a series of what are called reunion councils. And there are other things that are discussed and debated at these councils. But interestingly, at all of these councils, you generally had the bishops reach reconciliation agreements. And yet, when the Eastern bishops took those agreements back home to the East, the agreements were consistently rejected by Eastern Christians. Eastern Christians says, we don't care what kind of agreements you reached. We don't want to have anything to do with the Western church. Right? We are happy with the division. We don't want to have anything to do with it. And of course, the question always becomes, why? Why would Eastern Christians, not the bishops, but just the regular Christians, have so many problems with being unified with the Western Latin-speaking church? After all, you'd think it would be the bishops who would have the more important problems because of the theological concerns and the concerns about church leadership and the role of the popes. But they all reached agreements. The last reunion council happens in 1439. So they kind of happened in the 14th and 15th centuries. And the last one happens in 1439 in Florence, in Italy, right? And what scholars generally think as we look back on these reunion councils is that the thing that really sealed the schism in the minds of Eastern Christians was actually the Fourth Crusade. Right? It wasn't the Filioque, it wasn't the underlying tension, it wasn't even the role of the popes. It was the Fourth Crusade that really sealed the schism in the minds of Eastern Christians so that they would never want reconciliation with the Roman Catholic Church. The Fourth Crusade happens in 1204. Now, many of you probably know that the Crusades in general were an effort of the Western Church, right, centered in Rome, to send crusaders to help fight off Muslim conquest, making its way into the Holy Lands and into traditionally Christian territories, or at least that had been Christian, for 1,000 years. In the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders kind of end up in Constantinople, right, which is really the heart of Eastern Christianity. And they're told to kind of relax there for a few days until they continue on their journey to eventually fight the Muslims. Right? When they're there, they're kind of given free reign of the city. And what happens is a brutal pillaging of the city of Constantinople. Things are stolen, things are destroyed, artwork is burned, women are raped, there is murder in the middle of the street. It is an absolute nightmare what happens in the city of Constantinople, the heart of Eastern Christianity, in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. And nobody denies what happened. The Pope, the Bishop of Rome at the time, sent an official apology before the year was even over because everybody knew what had occurred by the Crusaders in Constantinople. We don't really know exactly why they did everything that they did. We often see stories of this where soldiers start to perhaps do a lot of immoral actions when they're even in a town that maybe they've liberated or a town that they should see as a friendly town. The testosterone happens and things get out of hand and really bad stuff occurs. And it definitely occurred in Constantinople. And the idea is that that happened in 1204, that even in 1439, 225 years later, at the last reunion council, the scars were still too fresh. And Eastern Christians still did not want anything to do with the church that they blamed for what happened in 1204 to the city of Constantinople, the heart of Eastern Christianity. That is what sealed the Great Schism in the minds of Eastern Christians. After that last reunion council of 1439, we basically have 500 years of silence between the two churches on an institutional level. Obviously, there are individual Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians speaking with one another, but the leaders really don't have any communication for about 500 years. It's only in the 20th century where there is an opening of the lines of communication. Some of it happens with the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church started to reach out to non-Catholic Christians and even members of other religions to try to work together on some issues. Part of it really was due to the reign of Pope John Paul II. John Paul II was a pope, but he was originally from Poland, which is kind of in Eastern Europe, is what we would say, and therefore in an area where, yes, you had Catholics, he was raised as a Catholic, but he would have been very aware of Eastern Orthodoxy within Poland, and he would have had a lot of friends who were Eastern Orthodox Christians. So he was kind of uniquely situated to help work with the Eastern Orthodox leaders once he became Pope. At one point, he even invited the Patriarch of Constantinople to give a sermon at a mass that the Pope was celebrating. That was a pretty big symbolic moment to show that maybe they could work together in promoting the gospel. At another moment, he stood with the Patriarch of Constantinople, and together they recited the Nicene Creed. And of course, everybody was wondering, what's going to happen when they get to that third section? Who is the Pope going to say the Filioque? Because then they'd be off. And they got to that third section, and the Pope did not say the Filioque, so that they could remain in unison as they recited the Nicene Creed. A sign of humility on his part, even though he had always recited the Filioque every time in his entire life of reciting the Nicene Creed. At this moment, he left it out to show the potential unity. Now, there are still to this day the two separate sides, the two separate branches of Christianity. There is the Roman Catholic Church, and there are Eastern Orthodox churches. There is some unity among all of those churches, but they are in some ways more independent. That's why we think of the Russian Orthodox Church or the Greek Orthodox Church or the Armenian Orthodox Church. So there has always been a room for more independence along national lines within Eastern Orthodoxy, and yet there is still something that we can meaningfully call Eastern Orthodoxy and see it as a unique branch of Christianity distinct from the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, both of these churches have spread around the world, but they still represent two branches of the Christian faith based on the schism that happened in 1054 due to those causes that I've mentioned. And despite the efforts at the reunion councils, the scars from the Fourth Crusade kept that division in place, so that even now, only in the last 100 years, are we really starting to see at least open lines of communication among the leaders of these two great branches of the Christian faith.